Chapter 23 is entitled Perfect Peace from the Prince of Peace. The verse that I would like to read is from Philippians 4, verses 6 to 9. Do not be anxious about anything. Whatever is true, whatever is noble, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is admirable, if anything is excellent or praiseworthy, think about such things, and the God of peace will be with you. Now that's what these stories I'm going to tell will describe in amazing specificity, how the God of peace came within the people's lives that we were applying this. Now the reason is a verse shown in Isaiah about whom Jesus really is. And it was simply said by that prophet in verse 3 of chapter 26, you, meaning God, will keep in perfect peace those whose minds are steadfast because they trust in you. And then in Isaiah again, chapter 9, the prophet was telling about this one who would make this all possible, Jesus Christ. He says, for unto us a child is born, to us a son is given, and the government will be on his shoulders. And he will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Jesus has always brought peace to those of his followers who are in step with his covenant. They're taking the obedient steps that he has shown them. The first example was of a friend of ours that was in one of our groups, and she and her husband were on a fishing trip, a camp way off in the boonies, many miles from the city. And early one morning, I got this telephone call, and she said her husband was out fishing, and there she was at the campsite, and she was all nervous. She was having a heart attack. She was a heart patient, and she was, of course, very anxious and scared. And so I said to her, following this directive that was in my mind, look in your billfold. Can you reach your billfold? She said yes, her purse. And I said, okay, get out the paper that we've written so many promises from the Lord on those paper, and get that paper out and let's start reading it. So she said, okay, just a minute. So she got her paper, and I could hear her unfolding it, and you could tell she was breathing real heavily and kind of moaning a little bit. And as she started reading the promises, she was hard of breath, and it was difficult to read, and I just kept encouraging her, no, take your time, go ahead and read the promise. So she'd read the promises, and she'd go right on to the next one, and the next one, and as she was reading the promises, then her voice got steady, and she began breathing normally, and so in a minute she said, well, I'm feeling better now. And I said, yes, just keep reading. So she would go ahead and read some more promises of the Father for her as a member of the New Covenant. And she just gained perfect peace. And she just said, well, J.D., thank you so much. Said, I'm not going to have to go to the doctor. My heart is all right, and I feel perfectly peace. And I said, well, why don't you just thank the Lord for his applying the truths that you've come to peace, because you've put your mind steadfastly upon him and his word. And so she did, and it was just so precious to her. And she just said, I thank you so much. And I said, well, be sure and tell your husband, and then tell your family about how you were blessed because you brought your mind back on the promises of God, and your terrible situation became peace-filled. The second was a car wreck event. The driver was trapped underneath the steering wheel of his car. It was near Colorado City, there in West Texas, and I knew the man. He was a big farmer wrestler, professional wrestler. He weighed maybe 320. He was a big man, and he was in a small car, and I just came up on the scene, and there was just some citizens there, and so, but he was pinned under the steering wheel, and he had a cut on him. I can't remember now if it was on his shoulder or arm, but somewhere, and he was scared, and he's a big man, and he was bleeding, and he would, as he would bleed, well, you could just see the blood coming out of, he had his hand on himself. I believe it was like this, and there was the window over here, so I was looking in the window at him, and he was trying to keep the blood from coming out. So I got my handkerchief and I put it on the wound, and I said, "Now you hold that down real tight, and now start listening to me." He said, "Okay." And of course, he was scared. He could just see his blood pumping out of him, so I just started singing some old hymns. I don't remember now what they were, but I just started singing some church hymns, and on purpose. And I would forget the words, or I would like "Blessed assurance, Jesus is mine. Oh, what a foretaste! Oh, what a And he began straightening me out. He began correcting the words. He would begin singing, "No, it's foretaste of glory divine." And so he would, "Heir of salvation." So he'd just start singing with me. And he would sing the phrases that I was not doing correctly. He was correcting me, and he just came to real peace. And then I just went to another hymn that I thought he knew. And anyway, so the blood quit. I was here watching him from outside the window, and so the blood quit coming up through his fingers. He was just calm, and so the pressure of his hand, and then him singing the hymn verses, brought him back to peace. And we just kept doing that, and then until the ambulance got there and the paramedics took over, and he was just in fine shape. His color was all right. He wasn't pale, or of course he was pinned under that wheel, but he was perfectly calm and quiet. And the paramedics didn't know what had happened, and they fixed him up. They went ahead and started doing their medical things. But it was just an amazing thing. Us bystanders were just watching this truth of the Prince of Peace bless that man in that emergency situation, because he had his mind and his heart upon Jesus Christ and upon the promises that those old songs were telling about. Okay, then the third story I was going to tell you took place there in Hudson Oaks at the church. One day I was on the staff, and it was a large group there, several hundred people in the auditorium, and all I knew was some ladies came and got me. I was up toward the front sitting in a row, and they got me, and they escorted me out to the back. And in the foyer there of the building was a nurse and 2 or 3 others, and they were helping a lady, about 35, 36-year-old lady, that was having an anxiety attack, and she was trying to, she was in the midst of losing her breath, and the nurse had gotten a wet cloth and was wiping her brow, but she was just upset. They had a paper bag. She was breathing into it. They were just doing all they could to calm her down, and no one knew what the problem was. And so I just knelt down and looked at her on my knees, and they had her in a chair, and she was just in a terrible way, and she was very anxious and very frightful and scared. And I don't know if she had a heart problem or something, but she was just about to lose it. And so I just knelt down beside her. I knew her briefly, and I knew her a little bit, and I just started doing the same thing. I started singing. I said, called her by her name and said, help me with this. I was thinking about the song, and I just started singing a hymn, and I messed the words up. And so she said, "Oh, JD," and I said, "No, help me with this." So she started helping me with the verses of the song, and I did the same way to another. And so I would stumble on the verses, not saying them correctly, and she would correct me and sing along with it. And she put the bag down and just started looking at me and started singing those songs with me. And I could see out of the corner of my eyes how these other well-intended friends were just amazed at how much peace she was getting. And they just stood up instead of being so concerned about her. And she just came. She sat up in her chair and just came at perfect peace. She was just quietly singing these songs with me. And the EMT got there, the people did, and they took her in. When they got out I just went on back into the auditorium, and it was just amazing. She didn't go to the hospital. They just looked at her a few moments and did a few tests and so forth, I understand, and then she left. But she came to perfect peace because she got her mind upon the Lord. Then 2 other I'll tell you about. One was in an inmate was in a straitjacket in a padded cell there at the Texas Department of Criminal Justice unit in Snyder, and I was there on some other matters, and one of the guards came to me and said, "Would you come with me to the cell block, the solitary confinement block?" And I said, "Yes." Well, as we approached there, I could hear this man screaming, just incoherent, loud screaming voice of, I didn't know what he was saying. It sounded like he was in terrible pain. Or anyway, as I approached, I could see that he had on a straitjacket, and he had on like a football helmet so he wouldn't hit his head, and he had his arms closed up, and he was in a padded cell, and the door, of course, was shut, but you could hear him screaming through there. Well, as I got into as I remember, the security officer said to me, the chaplain had asked to see if you would come see this man, and I didn't remember his name. I just remember that he had been in some of our services and knew him by his face. And anyway, so when I got into the little cell block there, and the door was opened electronically, well, I was talking to the, of course I could hear the man still screaming and hollering back there. And so I was talking to the security officer, now what is happening and what, and as I was just asking the security officer things, the man quit talking. The man quit screaming and hollering. And so we both noticed that. The officer was telling me a little bit of details about how they had found him, what he had done, and what so forth. Give me some particulars. And the man just settled down. And so then I went to the block, to the holding cell, and he was just sitting there in there with his head down. I could see him clearly. It's so well lighted. And I said to the security officer, "Will you open the door?" And he said, I said, "He's just been crazy for an hour or two," and said, "I wouldn't want to open." I said, "I think it'll be all right. I think this is why the chaplain sent for me." So anyway, two of the security guards came up, big men, to make sure that I was going to be all right. And so they opened the door, and there's the man sitting over on the bunk, 3 or 4 feet away. And he raises his head up and looks at me and says, "Hi, Brother J.D., how are you?" Just in a calm, clear voice. And so I asked them if they could release him. They said, "Well, let's wait a few moments." So I just started talking to him about, asking him what had happened to him that day and what did he remember about going all this. And he became very coherent. And he dropped his head and he said, "I'm just so ashamed of this." And so anyway, before it was over, they had the hat off of him, it looked like a football helmet, off of his head, and they had his arms loose down, and his arms weren't up together, they were just down. So he was sitting there in his cell, and we were just having a perfectly coherent conversation, and he was saying how much he wanted me to pray for him, and how he was giving some details of his life. But he had come to perfect peace as I had been in that presence of, in my presence had somehow or another brought the peace of God back into his life. And then the last one I wanted to mention to you was in the Big Spring State Hospital. One time a family called me and said, asked if I would go over to the hospital to see their husband, their daddy. He had tried to kill himself. He'd climbed up on a big tower, an electric tower, like a television antenna tower, and had tried to jump off, and the rope caught him. And anyway, he'd been trying to commit suicide. So all they did, the sheriffs came and they took him to the state hospital. And he'd been here a couple of days, and the family asked for me to come. And so when I went, I'm not sure we have the details all listed somewhere, but say it was on a Monday afternoon I got there. It was in another city. And so that afternoon I got to see him after lunch, say about from 1 to 2 o'clock. And he had a security person that had a rope tied on my friend, and then it was like a string, and it was on him. And so the string may be 8 or 10 feet long, but he'd had 24-hour care for 2 or 3 days because they were afraid he was going to do something to himself or another person. So there he was with a 24-hour care, and this attendant had a string. He could go here, there, but about 8 or 10 feet leash, you might say, so he wouldn't hurt himself. And he was strongly under medications. to keep him calm. I don't know the medications and such. But anyway, I'd just been praying that the Lord would give me information what to do. There were all kinds of people there that they would call, this was kind of what they call the lunatic place. It was just one step below, before you get a solitary confinement. And so all of these persons that were in pretty bad shape. And he was amongst them, and they had, as I said, he was having 24-hour suicide watch attended with him all the time. So that afternoon, just had about an hour with him, maybe an hour and a half, and he wouldn't look at me. He was just dazed. I couldn't carry on a coherent conversation with him at all. He was just in a bad shape, and so mostly I was just talking to him and just assuring him that told him that that his family had sent for me, and that I believe the Father would be able to restore his fellowship with the Father, and I was wanting him to get to talk with me. And I said, I'll be back in the morning, and I want us to have a good talk. And but you know that the Lord loves you, and I'm his example of him reaching out to care for you because I'm here. Now, we'll see you tomorrow, and I hope you have a good night's rest. And something like that because I just couldn't get much coherence with him. Okay, so I went back to the motel. Then the next morning, if that was Monday, so then say Tuesday, ate breakfast and went over to the Big Spring State Hospital. And so now I'm with him for about 2 hours, say 9 to 11 or something like that was my scheduled time. So same way, went in and there's another man that's attendant that's got a string tied to him. And so what they would do would let him and me sit in a little chair or two chairs, and then the man with the string, the attendant, would be kind of around the corner, so he wouldn't be looking at us, but he would have the string attached to my friend in case something happened, so we could have kind of a private conversation. Well, I just started saying some scriptures. I'm just trying to follow the Holy Spirit to say some scriptures or some verses that I thought he might know. And so I was just quoting him some of these scriptures, and maybe sang a little hymn or so, a little song, praise song. He was a good singer, so I just sang a little song or something with him. And his eyes changed as I was doing that. His eyes came back to coherency. Now, he'd had the same drugs, the same kind of medication and stuff. None of that had stopped. But his eyes flickered. I could tell that he was coming back to sanity, to being able to communicate with me. And so I took that as a sign that we could talk more. So I began talking to him about how much God loved him and how much Jesus understood all of these things he was going through, and that God had a plan for him, and that his life wasn't ended, but his life had purpose. He had a couple of girls at home. I think they were about teenagers by this time. So I got to talk to him about his family, and got to talk to him about the Lord and about some of the promises we had in common. And so he began answering some and talking some. Okay, so, see a notable change from the day before. So then I went to lunch, came back in the afternoon, I guess maybe 2 to 4 was our scheduled time. And so when I walked in this time, same arrangement, he still had the rope tied to an attendant. And we went to another room, came to the same thing, but the attendant was out of our way, but was, he could tell if something would happen and he would be right there. And now we just started talking about, he started asking me questions. And I was answering him biblically what the Lord said and trying to straighten out the confusions that he had, and assuring him of what the Bible meant and what the questions he was asking about, trying to give him Bible answers as best I know them. And so we were just carrying on a good conversation. By that afternoon, at the end of that 2-hour period, he was talking just like you and I would talk now. It was completely normal conversation. You could not tell there was any drug effect in his eyes or his mannerisms. And he was explaining again how, in his case, how, as you would expect, how ashamed he was of the things he had done, the choices he had made, and the pain that he knew had caused his family. And he was glad to get the answers to the scriptures that he'd been asking me about. And so that was the second day. I'd seen him once one afternoon and then 2 times this day. So then the next day, so that'd be like Monday afternoon was the first time, Tuesday. So then Wednesday morning, after I'd gone to the motel, Wednesday morning comes back about the same time, about 9 o'clock. And this time same place. But the attendant untied the string, and the attendant went over the little rope and went over and sat several feet away and just let us be there in 2 chairs. I don't remember if it was the same room, but the attendant was watching us, but he was no longer tied to my friend. And so we had a good 2-hour visit, and we got up, hugged each other, and talked, and just carried on a perfectly normal conversation. And so I was just amazed, and he was amazed. Anyway, so went to break, and went to lunch after we had that wonderful visit. Came back that afternoon, and as I remember, this would be like Wednesday afternoon. And as I went to the appointed place to come in, well, one of the medical persons, an administrator or something, said, Mr. Smith, he had my paperwork, said, would you come see me just a minute before you visit your friend? And I said, yes. And so we stepped in his office, and he said, what did you do? What have you done with this, with his patient? What have you done? And so I said, are you upset? He said, no, first off, I just want to know what you've done. So I just told him the story kind of like I'm telling you now. And he said, well, it's just an amazing thing. He said, we've checked him out, and he's just gotten better. He said he's completely sane now. He's not taking he's taking the same medications we had given him, but we are of course going to recommend getting him off these medications, and we think they may have been having a negative effect in his life. And I just wanted to know what you had been doing, and he basically said, oh, what you've been doing is like what they're calling the faith-based counseling. You're going to his religious roots. This man didn't appear to be a Christian at all, this medical person. I said, yes, sir, we're going to his religious experiences that we have in common. This is the Bible. I'm a Bible believer, Christian. And one of the promises is that God will keep him in perfect peace whose mind is steadfast on God. So that's what I've been doing through songs or answering his questions, Bible verses. And he said, well, that's just really fine. Said, I didn't know what it was, but he certainly improved, and said, we'll keep him here a few more days because we wouldn't want to let him go too soon. But he said, I don't think this was his advice to me. I think after you visit today, you don't need to come any longer. And so then I went to my friend. We had a nice, about an hour and a half visit, and just talked through a bunch of things. And I gave him a report as what this medical doctor had said. I don't know if he's a mental doctor, but anyway, this medical person that seemed to be one somewhat in charge of the goings on there. And so then we just had a wonderful visit, and so I went on back to my town and gave the report like I'd done every evening to the family by telephone, and I just said, please keep me informed what happened. And so then if that was Wednesday, well then 2 or 3 days later, he did get out. I don't know the length of time. I don't know what the standard process, but just a few days later he was out, and the family called me and he called me from his home and just said so much how they appreciated what the Holy Spirit and Father and Jesus had done in their lives, and they were starting over. They were beginning to once again attend church where they lived and ask for suggestions for a follow-up from my perspective. And that, as far as I know, that was many years ago, and I've seen the man off and on, his family through the years. As I say, they live good ways off, but everything, he's fine. He's living a normal lifestyle, and it was just the idea of a man that was actually locked away with lunatics. That's what I would call them, are just completely insane people right before having to be solitary confinement, at the point of having to walk around with someone watching him 24/7, 365, and the Lord completely restored him because he had faith in Almighty God through Jesus Christ, who is the Prince of Peace. And so I just rejoice with you, and I know you do me, at these stories. That's this chapter 23. Amen.